My name's Andy Johnson. I work for London School Online, which is one of 3 companies in a group. And the idea of the group is to help people communicate across cultures and across borders. So it was interesting hearing James talk about language. We kind of come at it from the other side in terms of helping people not just learn a language, but also use the language that they already have to do more, if you like. Looking at 3 things today, we'll talk first about the multi-generational workplace, what that actually means. We'll look at trends in the workplace at the moment, and then we'll finish with some ideas on meeting the challenge. So we're in a very interesting time at the moment because it's the first time ever where we've actually got 4 generations. We've actually got 5 generations working side by side, but one of those generations is on the way out, shall we say. So let's go through them and see who we are. So we've got the baby boomers, born between 46 and 64. Any boomers in the room? Oh, we have a couple. Don't get up. Stay there. Then we've got Generation X, born between 65 and 80. Yep, a few of you. And I think we'll have a lot of the next group, Millennials, born between 81 and 96. This is mainly going to be talking about you guys, okay? And then we have Gen Z. Any Gen Zs in the room? Oh, good. We have some. Excellent. So in terms of when these people entered the workplace, the boomers tended to enter the workplace in the early 60s, X in 82, Millennials at the end of the 90s, and the most recent is Z in 2012. And what does it look like? Baby boomers typically 55 to 73, very much at the top end of the companies at the executive levels, filling those roles at the moment. You mentioned Rolls-Royce in your talk as well. Organisations with a very strict, hierarchical, regimented structure. That's come from the boomers, I think. Generation X, does anyone know who this is? Elon Musk. Tend to be occupying most of the management positions nowadays, and their ethos was always work hard, play hard. I mean, the film at the time was Wall Street. And then Millennials tend to be filling most of the roles in companies at the moment, and they have what we would say is a self-centered work ethic. That might sound quite negative. What I mean by that is it's the first generation to really look at how they can make the workplace work for them as opposed to fit the systems that are already there. And then Generation Z, does anyone know who this is? Silence. This is Tiffany Zong, the world's youngest venture capitalist. Started when she was just 16 and is now filthy rich. Bit of an outlier for her generation, most of whom have recently entered the workplace, a lot of interns, a lot of graduates. And this generation has been identified as being naturally entrepreneuristic. So before we go on, just a quick activity, because we've just had lunch. Everyone's a little bit tired. So I'd like everyone to stand up, please. Thank you. Do this. Okay, so how have generations changed, not just the workplace, but life in general? We're going to run through the 5 key milestones of adulthood. Okay? There's widely believed to be 5 key things that we do as adults. If you have done them, stay on your feet. If you haven't yet done them, sit down. Is that clear? Okay, so let's try this. Number 1 is leaving school. Good, everyone understands the concept of the activity. Number 2 is leaving home. Aha, there go the Zedders. Interesting. Okay. Number 3 is becoming financially independent. You'd be surprised at how many people sit down at this point. Number 4 is getting married. Okay, and number 5, you can probably guess, is having children. Okay, well, round of applause for those who are still standing up. Now, can I ask what generation you are? I know that you said you're a boomer, and another boomer over there. What generation are you? X? Millennial? Millennial, and at the back? X? And... are you just standing up anyway? Yeah, okay. So if we were to... oh, thanks, you can sit down now, guys, thank you. So back in 1960, if we'd done that activity, 77% of women and 65% of men had done all 5 by the time they were 30 years old. Go forward 50 years to 2010, and only 13% of women and 10% of men have completed all 5 of those milestones by the time that they're 30 years old. So it's what one psychologist is calling this changing timetable of adulthood. It's not that these things aren't still happening, they are still happening, they're just happening later in life. People are staying at home with their parents for longer, people are certainly staying in education for longer, and people are entering the workplace later in life. There's a very good talk by a guy called Scott Hess on TED, and it's called Who the Millennials Are and Why We Hate Them. It's very, very funny. He doesn't hate them, it's very, very good. But he talks about this idea of the adulthood, the changing timetable of adulthood being some kind of roadmap, and millennials apply a road trip mentality to it. It's well worth having a look at. So, let's talk about these guys, the millennials, the most talked about generation ever. And I think this picture's great because it kind of sums up what a lot of people think about millennials. They're obsessed with technology, they're a little bit disconnected, very much into their craft coffee. We've talked about that already today, I think. But there was a piece of research by Deloitte, and I've forgotten the name. Joe mentioned this morning, and this kind of got me interested in the whole generational theory thing a few years back. But he mentioned that by 2020, half the workforce, so pretty much already half the workforce are millennials. And he made a very good point this morning, from a training point of view, half of the workforce are not millennials. But let's go forward 5 years, and that changes. So only 25% of the workforce in 2025 will be not millennials. Now, the average millennial stays in a job for just 3 years. And 83% believe that freelancing will be their career model. We've heard about gig economy in this country in particular. So as a result, only 1% of HR professionals believe that millennials are loyal employees. And I was speaking to an HR consultant on Tuesday, and she was saying, in 5 years' time, when millennials enter management positions, it's going to destroy everything. I was like, that's a little dramatic, don't you think? But the reason HR professionals are frustrated with this group is that it takes 7 weeks to replace a millennial, and often they take their talents to a direct competitor. So this got me thinking, really, if this is what people are saying about millennials, and this is what people are saying about generational theory, what is the truth behind it? So we're going to look at some of the generational trends in the global workplace and look at whether there's anything there that we can identify as causing these things. So the first thing, we're seeing a real rise in remote working. I'm doing too much clicking. And this is driven really by an exponential growth in technology. So for example, when the radio was invented, it took 38 years to sell 50 million units. How long do you think it took to sell 50 million iPads? A month? Not far off, 80 days. And that was just the first one. And then we've had the iPad 2 and all the different iterations of it. So really what's happening then is that we're growing up in a culture of technology where it's not just something is coming, it's then being replaced very, very quickly. That's what we mean by exponential. And as a result, people are entering the workforce with increased technical competence. When I started working at the London School, which was in 2007, there was a guy there called Robin, and his job was to train everyone how all the systems worked. And I remember he was showing me how the network worked, and I did something on the keyboard. I used a shortcut, and he went, "Oh, we've got a live wire here." Now, Robin's no longer with, well, no, it sounds like he's dead. No, Robin's retired, but we didn't replace Robin because increasingly people are coming into the workplace and they don't need this level of instruction. However, I mean, again, getting back to Joe's point this morning, we still have to be careful as trainers that we aren't neglecting the people that do still need the technical training. Flexibility is increasingly seen as a right. It used to be that flexible working referred to hours. Nowadays, it refers to location. And this was on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you can see this, but this is a post from Bethany Lang, and it says, "Today is the first day since announcing our fully flexible working policy that I've seen this, an entire department working at home today." And she talks about how uncomfortable that makes her feel. But with the tech, we've got this flexibility. But how do we use it? So I think organisations focus far too much on making sure that people have the technical resources to be able to work remotely. But what they neglect quite often are the other processes. Things around communication. What is the best medium of communication? Things around coordination, map your processes, make them centrally available so people understand when things need to be done. Culture is much harder to get right when you're working remotely. The cognitive trust that's based on competence and reliability is quite easy to gain. If you do something on time, that builds trust. But the effective trust based on feelings is much harder to get when you're working with remote teams. So I think there's always got to be an element of bringing people together face to face quite frequently. So this other big criticism of millennials, and I think it's equally applying to other generations as well, is this idea that we are increasingly hopping between jobs. But then if you look at the evidence as to why this is happening, we live in unprecedented times. We live in a VUCA era of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. I try very hard not to say the B word, but we are living in very, very uncertain times. When I first started researching this, we hadn't actually had the referendum vote. We also didn't have Donald Trump. We don't have this ridiculous situation with the leadership in this country, with multiple leaders and elections. There's also the increasing climate crisis as well. So we're living in really unprecedented times. My father worked for British Aerospace his entire life, and he told me a story about how employers would come to the school gates and try and encourage the children not to go to university. So he left school at 15 and worked as an apprentice, and then worked all the way through his entire life at BAE in Woodford and retired. Can you imagine that happening nowadays? Can you imagine staying with the same employer for your entire career? It's almost unheard of, I think. There was a study by PwC where they found that 75% of millennials they surveyed they'd compromised just to get a job, just to get onto the career ladder. They'd taken something that perhaps wasn't the thing they really wanted. So is it any surprise that they move on in these uncertain times affecting employment the way it is? Another thing to note is how children are being raised. I mentioned my dad. My dad was raised, his parents were from the silent generation, so-called because they believed that children should be seen and not heard. And my dad tried to raise us that way as well. He really struggled with that way. But nowadays, Generation X in particular have raised people, that we've got this idea of cheerleader parents, this idea that everything your kids do is wonderful. And we've got differentiated classrooms. When I was at school, we used to have the top set for English, the bottom set, and the middle set. I was in the top set for English. I was in the bottom set for maths, and it kind of made me feel quite awful. But nowadays we've got much more differentiated classrooms, the idea that you're teaching all the different abilities together, and it's the teacher's job to stretch some kids and give other kids more support. One of my colleagues was teaching in Italy, and she had a room of 20 teenagers, and her director of studies said to her, "You have to make sure that everybody wins at something every day." Challenging, huh? Because of how technology changes how we do business, and because it's changing jobs as well, businesses can no longer rely on workers who can only essentially do one thing. Getting back to my dad being an engineer. If you take marketing, for example, it's become incredibly complex. All the different channels, customer expectations for their journey, all the lines between various teams are blurring. And so you may not need to be an expert in a particular form of marketing, such as social media or email marketing, but you certainly need to be much more aware of it. So it's making learnability crucial to employability. You need to be able to learn to be able to survive. And then attention literacy. We switch media types 27 times every non-working hour. We don't just watch a movie anymore. We'll be looking at our phones. We'll be doing other things as well. I mean, I had to write this down because I thought it was amazing, but we even touch our phones 2,500 times a day. We might not do anything with them, oh, got a message, but we just touch them because they're so much more than phones. You mentioned what millennials are looking for in phones, and the camera and so on. They're everything, they're our entire lives. So we just touch our phones. Oh God, it's still there, I haven't lost it. Okay, 2,500 times a day, and we're constantly changing between our media types. As a result, we've got very little tolerance for user experience. If it doesn't work, if something doesn't work the first time, we probably won't go back. And increasingly, we're seeing what we call a half-life of information. Information doesn't have the same currency that it did years ago. And I've already shared this once, but I went to university here. It's a very strong mid-90s haircut. And if I did a history degree, and if I needed to find something out, I had to go and use this thing called the library, and these things called books, but I'm being facetious, but the thing is I had to remember and memorize all of the key dates and all of the key events so that when I came to be tested on it, I could recall all of this stuff. And nowadays that's gone because the data is there. We get it very, very quickly. It used to be that, I remember going to the pub and you'd end up having a conversation about something, and we'd be like, for example, I was talking to a colleague about this yesterday. We were walking in London in the Underground, and there was a poster for the new Bruce Springsteen album. And I was like, God, Bruce is looking old. He's looking really old. And then we were like, how old is Bruce Springsteen? And we were trying, because we were underground, we didn't have any mobile connection. So we had one of those conversations that you used to have before 4G and the internet, where you think, oh, I wonder what it is. How could it be? And you talk about it for a while. Nowadays, those conversations don't happen because someone whips out their phone and finds the information out straight away. Enough of that guy. So yes, we've got this idea of hypercognicity, the idea that you can pull information from a variety of sources, and increasingly Generation Z in particular are very comfortable at doing this. Does anyone know what this means? TLDR? Too long didn't read. Pixar, it didn't happen. Increasingly we're becoming visual learners as well. If there aren't pictures of something, did it really happen? I was at a conference a couple of years ago in Germany, and the speaker was talking about Generation X, and he had this lovely phrase. He said, Generation X are the last knowers of a life before the internet. And he wasn't saying it wistfully or negatively, but he was saying there's actually a responsibility to teach information literacy and to teach learners to be quite discerning about the sources that they see. So even though we're primarily work around language, we also do an awful lot of work on study skills and trying to get students who are coming over to the UK to study at UK universities to be hypercritical of the information they're looking at, to test it. And me-centricity is another theme. We're in an era of instant gratification. You look at Netflix, the way that's changed the way we watch TV. You look at Amazon. When was the last time you went on Amazon and couldn't find what you were looking for? If you can't find what you're looking for on Amazon, there's probably something wrong with you. Probably shouldn't be buying that stuff. But not only do you find what you're looking for, you also get all these other things that people bought. So I went to get my wife a present the other day, and it's like, people who bought this also bought this. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to buy that too. It cost me a fortune. Increasingly, consumption now is seen as access. It's not seen as possession. I'm sure you've all heard the things about how the world's largest taxi company doesn't own any cars, the world's largest accommodation provider doesn't own any properties, but it's also things like music as well. You know, when I was coming up to Grisdale College back in the day, the hardest part of the end of term was having to pack my stereo and all my CDs into a box. I wish we'd had Spotify then. It would have been so much easier. So consumption is not ownership, it's access. Whether you like it or not, I mean, increasingly with people getting stuck in the rental loop as well. So all this social connectivity is creating community-based learning. The idea, there's a recent research about Generation Z not identifying community with geography, but identifying community with beliefs. And increasingly there's an alignment of personal and professional ethics. It used to be that I think people would identify with a company who they felt shared their ethics. I'm going to buy from them because they're a green company. That's switched nowadays. You look at what is happening in Sweden with the climate movement. companies are increasingly having to change their ethics to suit what people are saying on social media and what people are wanting on social media. In terms of global teams and working together, the workplace, we've seen a real shift in collaboration. And I think this is a combination of the schooling system, social media, and increasingly technology as well. 10 years ago, your typical Monday morning would be to go in and check your email first and then perhaps open something on Microsoft Office. As remote working rose and digital work increased, teams expanded, these tools quickly became quite limited. And so we've already talked about Slack quite a lot today as well. Increasingly, we're using a host of solutions that are able to centralize work. I'm not suggesting that email is going the way of the dear letter yet, but I think it may do one day. For us, in what we do, whose English is very important as well, we provide English training for companies, but one of the first things we ask them is, well, whose English do you need? Because there are far more speakers of English as a second or a third or a fourth language than there are what we would call native speakers. So I try to avoid that term because it's quite negative connotations nowadays. So really, when we're putting in solutions for organisations, well, what English do you want? I mean, there's kids in Iceland who are really struggling with the internet has ruined the Icelandic language because it's bringing in an incredible amount of Americanisms into the language. And so there was a study recently that shows that Icelandic school kids can often think of the word in English before they can think of it in their own language. And then levels of formality as well. We in the West, we appreciate quite an informal approach to our learning. Though in other parts of the world that's different. We do a lot of work with Japanese clients, and there it's all about levels of formality. So we might have quite informal instructions, quite informal rubrics, but in Japan and also in Germany as well, actually, formality is still a key thing. Okay, so to finish, meeting the challenge, tying all this together. Well, there are factors to consider. I mean, to go through this very quickly, generational brackets certainly vary according to the research you use. Most studies focus on the Western world, though the work that we've done, we've also found that a lot of this applies to particularly China, the Middle East as well. And of course, individuals don't always fit into these neat brackets. They don't always share the same characteristics as their peers. So approaches to this, well, don't dwell on the differences, first of all. Just because you have a wide range of generations working for you, don't dwell too much on their differences, but focus instead on building collaborative, multi-generational teams if you can. Be very flexible and adaptable in your communication. I have a colleague who's frustrated that none of her team ever reply to emails, and I was like, well, don't send emails then. Try something else. I've got another colleague who's based in Sweden. He's feeling very peripheral because he never logs into Slack, and he misses those water cooler moments. But also your training as well. Consider a mix of face-to-face and digital. We're a bit short of time, but mentoring as well. I've always talked about mentoring, particularly peer mentoring, verse mentoring, but also increasingly flash mentoring. If you'd like to know more about that, please stop me afterwards. So, the next generation. We talked about millennials, Gen Z. Does anyone know the name of the next generation? That's my son, by the way. So that's where you go, Generation Alpha, born between 10 and 25. So maybe I'll come back in 10 years, Dave, and talk a little bit more about them. Cool, that's it. So just as I was mentioning, the London School Group online obviously is my part of the business. We've got the London School of International Communication. That deals much more with the soft skill side of language, presentation skills, negotiation skills. We work a lot with expats or people from the UK who are going to work overseas. The most popular course actually is working with the British, because we are very difficult to work with, believe it or not. So we train overseas multinational corporations how to work with the UK. The London School of English that you can see in the picture, that's the world's oldest language school since 1912. Some of the trainers are still there, going for over 100 years. And the three together create the London School Group, and we try to support and mix our activities as much as possible.